Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello, my name is Hasan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 121. With our book today, a story that is a tale being told by an unreliable narrator, covering morally salacious subject matter that, weirdly enough, challenge both the reader of the narrator's narration and did challenge, we believe, the author of the book. This author, who was quoted as follows when asked about the book, which was published in 1967, he said, and I quote, "I do not give a damn for public morals in America or elsewhere," close quote. This book, was written during a time when public morals were somewhat, and don't get me wrong, there have always been outliers, but were somewhat collectively agreed upon, but in a different direction than where they are now. And such a statement by a Russian writer in the middle of the 20th century definitely turned heads. By the way, he made this quote during an interview where he was being asked not only about obscenity and culture, but how can I put this? The fact of the Cold War was going on, which of course we forget now in our time. And of course, in our time, in the year of our Lord, 2024, such as it were, we culturally live in a different era. And if we have to be actually honest about all of this with this book, we live in an era, quite frankly, of Harvey Weinstein and Jeffrey Epstein. We also live in a world of average older men simping, and yes, I did use that word simping, for average younger women on Instagram and OnlyFans. This is the world we live in, folks, even if we think it doesn't impact us. We live in a world of on-demand instant pornography on your phone and sexual gratification on demand, just swipe left or swipe right. Our technology has enabled us to do all of that. And of course, we live in a public world where conversations about public morality don't even raise their head in the chat. And yet, as jaded as I am in reading this book, I was still rattled by the subject matter. And I wondered, as I have with a few other books that we've covered on this podcast, what exactly we were going to bring here to the table for our listeners today. But I concluded that if Muslim women, Islamic women, traditional Islamic women, can read this book in Tehran, well, then I can read this book today on the podcast. And so today we will be reading, or not reading, maybe we'll be summarizing and talking about the larger themes of the 1955 novel Lolita by Vladimir Nabakov. Leaders, here's my tip for today right up front. Watch out for unreliable, narcissistic, and solipsistic narrators, both online, especially online, but increasingly in real life. And of course, we will be joined today by a co-host, because I cannot do this by myself. Matter of fact, I didn't even suggest this book. The co-host did today. From episode number 63, where we covered The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. That was a deep and awesome conversation. We are joined today by Claire Chandler. consultant at Talent Boost, and author of her new book, Growth on Purpose. Hello, Claire. How are you doing today?
I am doing great. I love how you laid at my feet that I am the reason that we are unpacking this particular book today. But I appreciated the challenge. I accepted it for what it was, and looking forward to getting into all things croupy and literary and leadership today.
I always give credit where credit is due.
Fair
I,
enough. Fair
when
enough.
I cannot take credit for things myself, I give it the credit away. I believe that that is what a good leader does. And of course, when there is responsibility to be had, I take that on as well. So 99% of the books I pick here, but occasionally the co-host goes off and goes and picks something. No, that's not true. No. I probably would have read this book anyway. Eventually, at a certain point, I would have stumbled across it, probably in year 4 or 5 of this podcast, or maybe even 6 or 7. So it's good that I'm doing it early, and perhaps we'll revisit it a little bit later on. But in reading Lolita, we of course have to start at the beginning, and we're going to do our usual. We're going to summarize from this book, and we're going to talk about the literary life of Vladimir Nabakov. We're also going to talk about, like I said, unreliable narrators, and we are going to get into the sticky area of public morality and what exactly is the difference between morality and obscenity, and what is the sacred and what is the profane. Some things that we were talking about even before I pressed record on the book episode today. So there is a little bit of a story that I have before we really get into the book here, of how I came across this copy of Lolita that I'm going to be reading from today, and the version that I'm going to be reading from, because I always talk about that a little bit on the podcast. So Claire and I both touched to this content in different kinds of ways, and Claire can talk about the ways in which she got her arms around it herself. For my part, I did buy a copy of Lolita, the Putnam Classics version of it, which I was going to have today and show on the podcast, which I usually do. And then, oh gosh, we rescheduled this a couple times, and in the process of rescheduling, that's fine. That sometimes happens, folks, out there in listener land where you're listening to me. Sometimes, things happen, right? Life, right? And so we had to move some things around. Anyway, in the process of moving some things around, I moved around and packed up my copy of Lolita into a box, and now it is somewhere in a box deep in the bowels of my new home. And upon realizing that today, because I looked at the minimal number of books I had on my bookshelf and realized, oh crap, I don't have this book, I then turned and went to my local library. Trundled myself on down there. Yes, even in the era of the internet, trundled myself on down there in my little Toyota Camry and my gray silver sedan. It's very reliable, by the way. Walked right in, walked up to the desk and said, "Hey, do you guys have Lolita?" And the librarian, very nice young lady, she typed a bunch of things on the computer and she said, "No, we don't have it." And I said, "How could that possibly be? Who is reading Lolita in this town other than me?" And she said, "No, it's checked out. We don't even have it in a regional area, in a regional library. And even if we did have it, you'd have to wait 2 weeks." And I said, "Well, that will not work. So what is our other option? Because I need it in about 45 minutes for this podcast, and I would love to have a version if you have one." We went through a number of different swoops and swirls in trying to get a copy of this book, and finally wound up with a digital version of not Lolita, but a digital version of the Spark Notes of Lolita. So today on the podcast, that's just a little inside baseball, I am reading the Hoopla digital version of the Spark Notes of Lolita. All right. So now you can feel bad for me, because now you know how hard it was to produce this podcast today. All right. So going into the Spark Notes of Lolita, I'm going to get into I want to skip past the plot overview and the Spark Notes, and there's numbers of different characters who are, of course, in this in this book, as well as many themes, motifs, and symbols. And I'm going to sort of start with a summary of chapters 1 through 5 of the book, and we'll get into the characters and all of that. So when you open up Lolita, you wind up, of course, in the first chapter where the unreliable narrator, a gentleman named Humbert, is writing the tale of how he came to be incarcerated, the backstory, such as it were. And so we're looking at the story through the lens of his eyes. He admits to being a murderer, and he names different loves that he has had: Dolores, Lo, Dolly, and of course Lolita. And he explains that Lolita was not the first young girl to whom he was attracted. As a matter of fact, he refers to a particular young lady as Exhibit Number 1, but does not name her in the book. In chapter 2, he goes back to his childhood in Paris and relates how he had a frequently absent father and a kind yet strict aunt raise him. His mother died suddenly, and he describes this traumatic event with only 2 brief words: picnic and lightning. His father runs a luxurious hotel, and Humbert lives a healthy, happy childhood among the tourists on the Paris Riviera. As a matter of fact, he states that his sexual education up until the age of 13 was sporadic and somewhat dreamlike. This is, of course, a setup to prove that Humbert is not some moral animal. He's common. As a matter of fact, well, I'll get into Hannah Arendt in a minute here. He's banal, right? He's boring. He's average. In chapter 3, Hannah Humbert meets a young lady, a 12-year-old girl named Annabelle, who initially, he's just friends with her, and then it becomes a sort of a little bit of a love affair, but more on an adolescent level. And he doesn't have as clear a picture of Annabelle. He's forgotten her, right? And through those fumbling, awkward attempts at sexual engagement, Annabelle and Humbert never fully managed to get to consummation. And 4 months later, she dies of typhus. In chapter 4, he begins to have some insight into himself, and Humbert wonders if his desires for the attraction and for the engagement around young girls that began with Annabelle and ended with Lolita are somehow connected. He begins to maybe get some insight into himself. He also claims that he was that there were there were physical and spiritual components to his engagement with young girls that society could never understand, much less, the young girls themselves. He also tells the reader that he was only able to break free of Annabelle's spell when he met Lolita more than 20 years later. Finally, in chapter 5, and then moving quite quickly through these chapters, you're going to have to go read the book. It does move fairly quickly, but Humbert discusses his college days, where he switches from studying psychiatry to studying English literature. And of course, becoming moderately successful, he publishes a few books, so he's an academic. And during this time, he, of course, is attracted to young women who look like and who behave like young girls. And he begins to narrow in, by the way, on the age of the young girls that he's attracted to, usually between 9 and 14. Now, this is about the moment when I was reading the book where I went, what the hell are we getting into here? Exactly. And that's because when we look at Lolita and when we look at Humbert, we have to invariably look at the author of this book. And so Vladimir Nabakov was born in 1899 and lived until 1977. He was born into a wealthy and prominent family. His life sort of overlaps a little bit with Humbert in certain ways. And he was his family was part of the Russian nobility that was eventually destroyed by the Bolshevik Revolution and by Lenin. He was a Russian novelist, a poet, a translator, and weirdly enough, an entomologist. Interestingly enough, some of his entomology research, which is the study of bugs, has actually been proven in later research to be accurate and valuable and correct, which was surprising to me. Okay, so he was a man of many different talents and skills. Nabokov wrote his first 9 novels in Russian, and very few of them have been translated back into English, even into this day. While living in Berlin from 1926 to 1938, when the recent unfortunateness occurred of the 20th century called World War II, and there he met his wife. Just like most folks from Europe who could get out, after you wrote 9 novels, you kind of were a little bit of a literary star. So he was able to exit Berlin and able to exit Germany as quickly as his little Russian legs would carry him. And he landed on the shores of, interestingly enough, Ithaca, New York, where I used to live. And he became a professor of Russian literature at Cornell University, the other university in Ithaca. In 1955, he wrote Lolita, and that novel ranked 4th on the Modern Library's list of the 100 best 20th century novels in 2007, and is considered one of the greatest works of 20th century literature. Nabokov's Pale Fire, published in 1962, ranked 53rd on the same list, and his memoir, Speak in Memory, which was published in 1951, is considered among the greatest nonfiction works of the 20th century, placing 8th on Random House's ranking of 20th century works. Nabokov was noted as a 7-time finalist for the National Book Award for Fiction, and as well as being a lepidopterist, he was a composer of chess problems. He would have really liked AI. Actually, I think he would have really liked a lot of things about the 21st century if he had lived long enough to see it. And so that gives you a little bit of an underpinning on Nabokov and on Humbert Humbert and the first 5 chapters of Lolita. There's a lot right there. And so I've thrown all that at Claire. And so I'm going to open up, I'm going to step back a little bit from my soliloquy here. I'm going to ask Claire, what are your thoughts about
why the
Lolita?
Heck this book?
Yeah, what are your thoughts about this book?
It's a short question and yet a huge one, right? When we were first discussing which book to unpack for our second conversation, this was not the one that I should have gravitated to. In its simplest, basest form, it is about a pedophile. Let's just put that out there, and let's just be honest with that, so your audience doesn't go, "Do these 2 knuckleheads not realize that this guy was a pedophile?" And yes, at his basis, that's how he would be defined. That's how he was defined.
Correct.
That's how he lived his life. And the subject matter was one that I would not typically gravitate to. But as a lover of English literature, that was my major in college. It would be remiss of me to ignore this classic that has stood the test of time for a variety of reasons. And so if you can somehow make your peace with the subject matter, however you choose to do that, the language, the prose, the literary art of this particular novel really does pull you in, subject matter aside or not. And obviously you can't just discard the subject matter, the tragedy of it mixed with comedy, the English and the Russian and the French mixed together so seamlessly, the beautifully flawed protagonist and the equally ruined and ruinous nymphette. There is a complexity to this that goes beyond, well, it's just a story about a dirty old man. And so, I do think there are many reasons why this narrative has stood the test of time. And I think as you and I do, we can draw from that some parallels to what it says about leaders as a species. Sure, what it says about some guys as a species, but really what it says about leadership and society and, the environment around us and nurture versus nature. And so I'm glad I read the book. I was actually walking through my town earlier today and stumbled upon a very small bookstore and looked in the classics section. And sure enough, right below Iliad and the Odyssey was a copy of Lolita, and I thumbed through it and I thought, is anyone going to see me leafing through Lolita and wonder about me?
Well, they may wonder about me after this podcast episode today.
Yeah. Yeah.
And look, you're exactly right, Claire. I mean, we've got to go at it immediately. So, yes, he's a pedophile. He's what we would call in our time a child rapist. That's what he is. He's taking advantage of well, no, let me reframe this. He is either manipulating or allowing himself to be manipulated by, and again, this is the unreliable narrator part, by his appetites and desires for individuals who are not at the age of consent. And the age of consent differs in different states. I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about is there is a sense I get from Nabokov that he wanted to take all of his intellect and his towering ability to structure a story. And he's combining in things from Edgar Allan Poe. He's combining in things from allusions in French words that even I didn't understand. I had to go look up some of the allusions. He's bringing in ideas from Greek mythology about sort of what does sexual desire look like and how is that framed, which, by the way, I'm going to make a point about that in just a minute. He's also bringing in historical understanding of the nature of relationships between not just grown men and women, because Humbert does have a relationship with a grown woman inside of here, which he doesn't frame as predatory, but I'm sure she would, interestingly enough. He blends all of this together, and it takes a towering intellect to figure out, well, no, I'll frame it this way. It takes a person who wrote 9 novels in Russian and got famous off of that and spoke like 4 different languages, who was also a lepidopterist and solving chess problems, who was so, and maybe this is the Luciferian conceit, so in love with his own intellect that he was like, how can I take this unmentionable thing and turn it into something that is art? It takes that kind of thing. It takes that kind of thinking to do that. Now, should he have done that? Should he have used his skills and his talents in a different way? And as a person who went to art school, I love having the should he, shouldn't he, shouldn't he have conversation. I love that, because from there, I think you can do some interesting things. But if you don't want to have that conversation, the fact of the matter is, it does take a towering intellect to do this, to take something that is dirty at the bottom of it, right? And to try to elevate that, that content. And so I agree. Like, we have to nail that right up front, right? And it made me uncomfortable. I mean, it did. I was not comfortable reading this book. I was not comfortable reading this book. Matter of fact, I'm probably going to put a little bit of an explicit warning on this episode, because of some of the things that we're going to get. Like, my kid's not going to listen to this episode. My wife is probably not going to listen to this episode, right?
My parents will not be listening to this.
Right. Like, so, and so the question becomes, how do you, well, you might as well go right at this. Okay, so when he says, I don't give a damn about public morality, what does that reveal about his psychology as a writer that he has put into this book?
Well, you said something interesting before we started to record this, and I want to sort of tee you up to share that with your audience, which was around, clearly the author had this, if not this subject matter, this thought, this ideation, this what if scenario going through his mind, and turned to this narrative form as the outlet for that.
Yep.
And so I'd love for you to kind of unpack that a little bit, because I think you're 100% right. Like, was this his solution, his only solution to either acting on that impulse himself, or somehow imploding from the weight of this is such deviant thinking?
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, he writes this book in 1955, right? Or it's published in 1955, which means he was probably writing it, let's say he came up with the idea maybe at the end of World War II, maybe around 45, 46, probably if he, and, you know, obviously I have no idea how he created novels, but I know how I create books. I mash around with 3 or 4 ideas in my head for a couple of years. I go and seek out information on those ideas. I have a giant sampling tool called Google, which he didn't have. Okay, cool. I Google a few things here and there, and then I backburner it. I might write a couple of blog posts. I backburner it again. I start talking about it to other people. By the way, that's usually year 3. About year 4 or 5, I'm ready to like commit something to paper, or commit something to the computer or Scrivener or whatever my tool is. I've got some notes laying around. I've got some ideas. And then even then, I'm still mashing. And then something pops out in year like 6 or 7. And then boom, I've got a book. If he did that, that matches up with the timeline. Starts thinking about it in 45. Well, what was happening in 1945? Well, we were just coming off of globally the last globally apocalyptic world war. I mean, genuinely apocalyptic world war in a way that we don't understand. No, I won't say we don't understand. In a way that still scares the hell out of us even now. And we're doing everything we can to possibly avoid that. And that has nothing to do with the nuclear implications. This is just, oh, we don't want to trundle off 162 million people off the planet. We just don't feel like we want to do that. And we're still scared by the psychic and spiritual weight of that, which is, by the way, a good thing. That's not a bad thing. I'm not saying this is a negative, right? At the same time, we're also trapped in a time of incompetent and maybe even malicious leadership. And so we're struggling right now to avoid, globally anyway, we're struggling to avoid that. Well, he's coming out of a time when the ruins of Europe, the Europe he remembered, the Europe of his childhood, right? Born in 1899, he experienced not only the Russian Revolution, but also experienced World War I directly, then went through and published Russian novels between 26 and 38 in Berlin during the Weimar Republic, saw the rise of Hitler. And by the way, Hitler, when everybody just thought he was a guy you could do a deal with. This is what everybody knocks Hitler. Like I've seen the meme floating around. I don't know if you've seen this with the Paris Olympics that were recently around. There's this meme floating around from some folks on the left where it shows everybody kind of sig heiling at the 36 Olympics and goes, oh, that opening ceremony was infinitely worse. And I'm like, and this is the phrase below the meme, and I'm like, except in 36, nobody thought Hitler was a problem. Like he was just a guy you could do a deal with. Just give him the Sudetenland and he'll be fine. Peace in our time. Stop making memes about things you don't understand. Stop it. Stop it.
Just because you have the technology, right? Yeah.
Right. Just because you have the paraphrase in Jurassic Park, just because you could doesn't mean you should. So, so that's happening, right? And at the same time, he comes to the United States where, yes, he shows up at Cornell University, but Ithaca College at that, Ithaca, New York at that period of time, other than Cornell University, was a rump town. Like, please, like you could get bread for 3 cents, but no one could buy bread. No one had 3 cents to rub together to buy bread. It was the Depression. So he's walking into these psychological situations. And you have the straitjacket of morality at that time, Christian public morality, let's be very clear, where forget having, you know, the 10 commandments on every street corner, like maybe the state of Louisiana might want to do. Forget that. They weren't doing that because nobody needed to do that because everybody knew what the hell the 10 commandments were. They just knew it. He's a European coming into a Russian European, coming into an American place where we don't have a concept of nobility. We're just fine. People talk these days about Americans being provincial in our thinking. we are European level geniuses in comparison to what it was probably in the 20s and 30s, where 90% of people worked on farms. They raised their food. Industrialization hadn't yet hit, and there was a depression on. That's provincialism. That's the environment he walked into. Where's the and so the question becomes, and yes, he's married, but it was probably, and I don't want to speculate anything about the man's marriage, but I suspect that coming out of a Russian nobility sort of posture, being raised in that way as a child, and coming out of a European, because he went to the best places and he had a really, really awesome life with his father and mother. I suspect he had the best things. And so to come to America, America? Who wants to come to America, right? But he had no choice. Where else was he going to go? Otherwise, the Germans would have gotten him. He probably would have wound up in a concentration camp. Hitler was looking for this kind of guy. When Hitler talked about the degenerates in art, he was talking about guys with this mindset. He would have gotten Nabokov, and Nabokov couldn't go back to Russia because Stalin would have gotten him. So you've got to go forward. You got to go live with the provincial people in Appalachia. So all of that is framed around him, right? And so my thinking goes, and you can't see it on the video because Claire's smiling because she knows where I'm going. Where's the release valve for you if you're that guy? What's the release valve? Where does your pressure go when you're underneath all of that psychological and emotional and sociological pressure? Where do you get an outlet or a release? Because he's a human being just like anybody else. So he needs an outlet and needs a release. Was he already a deviant? Maybe, maybe not. But things grow inside of people. So, I mean, he would have been what? 1948, 45. He would have been what? In his mid 40s by about that time? I mean, you can maybe put down Lolita to being the result of a midlife crisis. That's sort of where my brain goes.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too, to your question about where else was he going to go physically and literally, in a literary sense. Because his other option was just to suppress that deviant thought,
Yep.
of whether it was purely, I've got this idea for a book and it's a little bit out there, or I'm having these impure, immoral thoughts about the girl next door, and I don't know what to do with that. And
or the girl at Cornell in my class.
Yeah, exactly. And so, when he says things about I don't give a damn about morals, I think he very much gave a damn about morals, but he needed that outlet. And I don't know, like you, I don't know what his marriage looked like, but I came across an article not too long ago that the reason he actually published the book, he has his wife to thank for that, because she caught him burning an early draft of the manuscript. And so I don't know what brought him to burning it, whether he was just a perfectionist and didn't like the draft, or maybe he felt like getting it out on paper was so cathartic, he had accomplished what he needed to by getting it out of his head, and therefore, didn't want it to see the light of day. I don't know.
Well, let's talk about that wife of his for just a minute.
Oh yeah, let's. Because of all the manuscripts that she said, no, honey, it's not that bad. Let's talk to a publisher about it or get some beta testers. Right. I mean, it was this one. So listen, either, again, we don't know the marriage. Either she's, she was letting her freak flag fly as well, or she was just the most supportive spouse in the history of the world.
Well, and this is, and maybe it's, I'm a big fan of the show NYPD Blue from back in the 90s. I'm like going through and watching NYPD Blue again and realizing certain things about that show. And one day I will talk about it in context with a different book, because I'm thinking of some threads here that are going to be very, very interesting. It is the ultimate unraveling. If you think about it in terms of like the fourth turning, it's the ultimate third turning unraveling show, where people are just trying to hold on to the past as much as they possibly can, while all of this future stuff is rushing at them, and the degeneracy of the culture is just hitting them full force. And they're cops, so they're at the leading edge of all of this, and they're trying to hold on to their morality at the same time, and everything's just sort of floating away. Anyway, we're in a different spot right now. For the last 25 years, we're in full-on chaos now, and have been for a while. But we don't talk about, and you see this with Stephen King too. And I'm not talking about the Stephen King you see on Twitter, not that guy. But interestingly enough, I think if you give Nabokov Twitter, he would have been Stephen King on Twitter. He would have been that guy, because that would have been a different release valve, right? Stephen King's wife, Tabitha, edited all of his scripts when he was a young writer. I think she edited Cujo, if I remember correctly. He writes about this in On Writing. Cujo, Carrie, and a couple of other ones, right up to I think the Tommy Knockers, which he wrote high on out of his mind on cocaine, right? And he doesn't even remember that book. But the spouses of writers can either be totally diametrically opposed to whatever it is they're doing. Like Karl Marx's wife, she didn't care what he was doing. She was like, just go get a job. I would like to eat, you know. Or they can go all the way over into I'm going to full on support you and I'm going to full on go on with you, whatever it is, because I'm in love with the intellectual creativity that you're espousing. We don't nearly talk nearly enough about that. And without these spouses, some of these books would not see the light of day, including, I think, Lolita. But I don't know, because I'm not married to this woman, and I presume you're not married to this man. I don't know. Well, no. Here's how I'm going to frame this. This is very uncomfortable. Here's how I'm going to frame this. If I wrote something like this, my wife would have me burn it, and then my wife would have me committed. And then I'd probably be getting a divorce. Yeah, I'd be on to the second Mrs. Haston Sorrell somewhere down the line, right? Like there's no first Mrs. Haston Sorrells anymore. Like it's done, right? I don't know what kind of, because she's also silent in this, right? We only have Nabokov's version of whatever it is she's putting out in the world. We don't. The modern feminist would say she's been robbed of her agency, right? She was robbed of her voice. But I don't know if that's true. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if I'm not quite sure that her voice didn't come out through the publication of the book.
Well, some people actually, I think at the time I read something else, they asked her directly, was she somehow the inspiration for the character?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that she answered that. I don't believe that she did. And just a comment on Tabitha King for a second, because Stephen King is the first to say that he gets most of his book ideas from dreams he has. I mean, whatever medication he's taking before he goes to bed at night, he might want to reconsider, because I enjoy reading his books, but I would not want to have the dreams that he has.
I think his dreams were different before he had the car accident versus afterward.
That's probably true.
Yeah. I think the car accident broke a lot of things down deep in there, because he's not the same writer that he was.
No, well, yeah, and he, from what I understand, makes a lot of use of ghostwriters, more so now. But again, talking about writing as an outlet, if these are the sorts of things that pre-accident were running around in his subconscious when he's trying to sleep, he needed an outlet as well. So I think your point, there's two of them that are really important right now. The one is using writing as an outlet for behavior and plot lines that may otherwise not be acceptable in civilized society. Mm-hmm. And the role of the spouse in either facilitating or suppressing your creative genius.
Right. And yeah, well, and the old phrase, the hand that rocks the cradle is the hand that rules the world. That old phrase, that old hoary old phrase that no one says anymore. Still is true. I mean, it is, women have a lot of private power, not public power, which we're seeking to, for good or ill, and the jury is out on all of this, but we are seeking to reshape public power in a more feminine mode, and we shall see how that goes, particularly in America. But private power, women have a lot of private power. So, and I'll give you just an example of this to back one data point to back up my idea, my thought here, my conclusion here. The number one group in the United States that is marketed to on the internet, if you look at marketing research, is young women ages 15 to 34. Number one group. The group that is marketed the least to on the internet, take a guess. Who would it be?
I was going to say still women, but in a much higher age bracket.
You would think so,
Yeah.
but they're not at the bottom. Oh, no, no, no. There's one
Huh.
group that's at the bottom. Men ages 45 to 54 are the least marketed to group on the internet because they
Wow.
are, according to marketers, the hardest demographic to touch because they spend no money. They seem to have no desires. They don't click on anything. They don't comment, and they stay the hell away from everything. There's an overlap there, though, because I can tell you as a man who is between 45 and 54, all of my money goes to women between the ages of 15 and 34. Now, that's just my data point. Other people's data points may vary, but I am the least marketed to demographic on the internet. Period. Full stop. The internet is not, at least the modern internet with social media and all those kinds of overlays. It ain't for me. There's nothing out there for me. That's part of the reason why I do this podcast, because this podcast appeals to people who are men who are in managerial positions who are my age. No one talks to us outside of maybe three different areas. There are three primary areas that we do get to talk to: sports, alcohol, and gambling. Those are really like the three. Those are kind of the big three. And then the other stuff that goes along with gambling,
I thought for
prostitution,
sure
and
you'd
all
say
that.
guns. Don't you live in Texas?
I do live in Texas. Yeah. So guns in Texas, but that's regional, right?
True.
Like
All right. Fair
even
point.
though they're
Fair point.
right, it's like you're going national, like it's those three, right? Gambling is everywhere.
Yep.
I even just got a text message the other day. Would you like to see Texas do casino gaming? I'm like, I don't, why are you bothering me? But I know why, because I'm in the demographic that goes and gambles. So where is the discretionary income coming from? That is a key question. Um, that is a key question when we we'll just ignore that. It's fine. We'll edit it out. That is a key question when we look at those demographics. And so the private power of women, this is just my larger point here, the private power of women, based on the public money that men make throughout and give to them, quite frankly, does shape the world. It just does. Now, again, we can argue if this is right or wrong. Is this a good or bad? Is this an up or a down? Should we change this? I'm really more of a person who just looks at these are the facts, and then we can argue about them afterward. So
I I think you just came up with the subtitle for this episode, though, The Private Power of Women, because I was about to say a couple of moments ago, when you talked about sort of the public narrative is not really the woman's narrative. You didn't say exactly those words, but
I
but
think
you know,
we're shifting it over. We're
it's the
shifting it
private
over
power.
gradually.
Well,
Yeah,
but what's interesting is when you do think of that in the context of Lolita, the entirety of what Lolita did and said and felt and manipulated and who seduced whom, etc., is completely written from one person's perspective.
correct.
We never actually get her side of the story.
That's right. Yep. No, that's exactly correct. Which makes
And
Humbert an
and
unreliable
yet,
narrator.
well, yes, and yet the private power that she wielded from the second he saw her
Mm-hmm.
was undeniable.
Yes, and it makes us all very uncomfortable. And I think that at the bottom of it, beyond just the age difference piece, I think that that's the other dragon floating around underneath that I think is the the dragon that, because he spends 3/4 of the book obsessing over this young lady. Almost no physical engagement occurs between them. And then when it does, interestingly enough, because I was weirdly curious how Nabokov is going to deal with this, because for a good third of the book, almost a third to a half of the book, it's just internal in his head, right? And it builds up and builds up and builds up and builds up, and then you know there's a series of unfortunate events, to paraphrase a Lemony Snicket. We'll get into those in a minute, and Humbert, achieves his goal, right? And it's all in one paragraph. And I was like, that's okay.
Well, and remember how he framed it.
Oh, yeah.
She seduced me.
Right. Exactly.
She seduced me.
And I'm
She's
like,
12.
okay, well,
Yeah.
no, no, no. Mm, And so you're left with this sense of, and again, this is the dragon floating underneath. How how do we, and I do believe that writers like Nabokov and others that we've covered on the podcast do seek to tell or develop larger meta narratives that explain reality. I think that's the point of writing in general, which is why, again, one of the other reasons why I do this podcast in this way, because everything from Shakespeare to Jane Austen, these authors are trying to create a meta narrative of reality. They're trying to explain what they're seeing beyond the mere material. I don't think Nabokov had a good, I will frame it this way. I got the sense he couldn't get his meta narrative to click in that particular moment because there was this other dragon of her desires, or even just giving her a voice that he didn't deal with. And maybe that would have been too complicated even for a towering intellect such as his. I don't know.
Well, so yes, I mean, how to structure the narrative from even someone who knew how to construct complex chess problems. So there's that piece of it, which is maybe why he didn't go there. But there was also the character of Humbert. Humbert
Mm-mm.
didn't want to introduce her side of the story.
No.
Because remember, his character is writing this from prison.
Right.
In some way, in for two reasons, at least two. There's probably more. One of which was to sort of humanize himself, to say, you have to understand from, my earliest days, like this is, since I lost Annabelle so tragically, and we had sort of, let's call it what it is, coitus interruptus at the beach, and I never got to consummate that great love. And then I kept trying to find it again throughout my adulthood. So there was that piece of it, but he was just sort of trying to defend himself and say, this is why this all transpired. And don't forget, she seduced me.
Right.
But the other piece of it, and him being magnanimous about it and saying, I don't want this to ever, hit the public eye until after both of us are gone. He wanted to immortalize her.
Right.
Because he did finally find his nymphette.
Right. Right. Well, and there's another thing floating around underneath here, because we're talking about this in the context of, well, not in the context. We are speaking about this book that was written as a direct thumb in the eye to talking about, Nabokov in the 1920s and 1930s coming to America, a place where America was still at that time, and the things were beginning to unravel a little bit, but not to the degree that they are now. But he had come to a place where absolutism about what morality was very clear. The lines were very clear and very sharp. The relationships between men and women, very clear and very sharp. Roles highly delineated. Was there spaces for people to move back and forth? Sure, but not nearly as much wiggle room as there is now. Now there's wiggle room all over the place. I mean, we're struggling to define gender and fluidity and all of these other kinds of things, right? We're struggling at a cultural level around all of these areas. There was no struggle in 1930s at Cornell University. There was no struggle. And so he's coming into this environment where you could be sophisticated and outre and European, and I brought this up already, but you're coming into a place where the lines are black and white. And so how do you navigate that? How do you find the wiggle room, right? Where is it? Is there any wiggle room? Or is the only solution to smash that? And so, as I mentioned before in the opening, we read this in a Western Christian context, which again, the outlines of the box are still hanging around, even though the core of it might be gone. But if you read this in Islam, with the dynamics of child brides, the dynamics of the Quranic book of war and the Quranic book of peace, and I've read the Quran, I know what it says. If you read it in that context, particularly in the context of fundamentalist Islam, which I believe is the focus of reading Lolita in Tehran, that book, Tehran, come on, let's be real here. that's going to be at a certain level totally, the subject matter is going to totally match what's actually being seen um at a regular level by people who are coming out of an Islamic context and a Muslim context, which is totally different than a Christian one. All right, just something else to put into your hopper there.
Well, and it brings up the, as you say, the frame of reference could not be more different for a Muslim woman in Tehran reading Lolita.
Right.
Now we're 20 years ago, and a Christian woman in New Jersey, in America,
Right.
reading
Right.
it with, with the privilege, right? The white privilege, female privilege, American privilege, call it what you want, to make certain judgments about the book,
Mm-hmm.
which are different evaluations than my Muslim counterpart in Tehran.
Sure. Or even a Hindu counterpart in New Delhi.
Absolutely.
And so this is, I think that at the bottom of it is maybe getting close to the substrate of why this book keeps being published and keeps being read, because there's
Well,
something here that allows it to be decontextualized and
yeah.
deconstructed to a lot of different places.
Well, and what's interesting too, you used the word struggle, that there was no struggle at the time that he was writing that, because it was black and white, and this was what was, a normal relationship, and this is what wasn't. I would actually argue it's not that there wasn't a struggle, there was no ambiguity about
Okay.
what an acceptable consensual relationship between two people was
Right.
defined as. But there was still a struggle, because we both know that now that it's 2024, it's not all of a sudden people have different thoughts, different definitions of what love looks like or who they're attracted to.
Right.
Right. It's just the rules were not ambiguous at all, but the struggle, if you didn't fit within that carefully defined parameter of, I mean, we all kind of accept now you can't help who you love who you love, etc.
Sure.
But the mores around what you can act on and what you can't were different. And they're
Right.
different
Yeah.
here in America in 2024
Yeah.
than they are in Tehran.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And they're about to be even wilder 10 years from now. When artificial intelligence, I mean, is at that point will be fully ramped up. I mean, it's already starting with I mean, I don't know if you've seen this, but the we're no longer talking about the singularity. We're not talking about transhumanism in full force, right? Where we can, well, we've already kind of glided over this a little bit, but bend our biology to our will. We would be the first civilization in human history if we make it through that, which I think there's some potholes and minefields in there that we have not yet considered, as there always are, that may blow up the whole project in our face. But if we avoid those or navigate them, we will be the first civilization in human history, in the long pantheon of 5,000 years of civilization, that's actually able to transcend their own biology. Now, I don't believe fundamentally we'll get there, but if we do, they're still going to be reading this book, because there's going to be something else in there that we cannot transcend. And I think this book touches on that. Again, touches on the substrate of that. And that's why it's able to move around in all of these other contexts and still be read, gosh, almost 80 years later? All right, if I haven't convinced you that you at least need to pick up the book, you're listening to this podcast, go get it. Go get yourself a copy. Struggle for the first 5 chapters. Actually, you should struggle through this whole book, quite frankly. If you're not struggling with it, you might need to question yourself. But go and get it. Go struggle with it. Go wrestle with it. And for right now, we're going to get back to the book. We're going to summarize. I'm going to kind of move through a little bit, because we kind of ground out a little bit in the first part, because there's all kinds of interesting things that happen in the next part of this book in chapters 6 through 10. So Humbert, we pick up with Humbert, of course, because again, it's all written through his lens. And he has an affair with a young prostitute who is not a nymphette, but she is as close to a nymphette as he can get. And she matures out of that phase And then he begins to realize in chapter 6 that he's not getting any younger. He's becoming a creepy old man. Now, the term creepy old man is never used, but Humbert sort of glides around this term and through it, which I did think that the verbal wordplay to not say that was very interesting on Nabokov's part, to kind of lean away from that and to kind of get us to give sympathy to Humbert. And he winds up getting married, and in an effort to curtail his illicit desires. And he marries a Polish doctor's daughter named Valeria. And he states that despite his success with adult women, he considers himself hopeless in matters of sex. And of course, because he is hopeless in matters of sex, the entire marriage blows up. He picked Valeria because of her doll-like features and her childlike nature. But he finds her to be intellectually inferior to him, which I think is another subplot that we don't often talk about. And that is referenced in Humbert's writing. And this is why I think Humbert's a reflection of Nabokov himself. Humbert's writing, he goes off, becomes a writer. He does this, he does that. He escapes to America after the marriage, blows up in a divorce. He has all these internal desires that he can't act on. There's this idea floating around in the modern manosphere called the social sexual hierarchy, where there's gammas and omegas and deltas and sigmas and alphas and all this. And he would be, if you know what any of that language is, and if you don't, you can go Google it. He would be a classic gamma. And a classic gamma is the guy who believes he's so smart and believes he's so, intellectually capable that no one could possibly understand him. But he also has a touch of resentment on the bottom of him as well. And you get the sense of that during the marriage to Valeria, with Humbert. So Humbert divorces Valeria after she confesses to having an affair with a taxi driver, weirdly enough. And by the way, it's not weird, again, in that social sexual hierarchy idea. If the taxi driver is the alpha, it's not really that weird. And so Humbert feels betrayed and thinks about killing her, which again is the behavior of a classic gamma. And he later learns in subsequent years that Valeria died in childbirth in 1945, after they moved to California in order to participate in a psychological experiment. After that marriage, Humbert moves on and winds up in New York, where he takes a job transcribing French literature and writing perfume ads. He, of course, stalks or weirdly watches the young ladies in Central Park and has a breakdown due to the stress of his job. After his release from a sanitarium, he takes part in an exploratory trip to the Arctic, and that improves his health. And then upon his return, he regresses a little bit and has another psychological breakdown. And then he goes to a small town to stay with a Mr. McCoo. Now, the small town of Ramsdale, he learns that the town, or the Mr. McCoo's house is burned down, and he winds up at a boarding house at 342 Lawn Street, run by Mrs. Hayes. Mrs. Charlotte Hayes. And this is at this point that Humbert begins to develop his alter ego, Claire Quietly. And there's a twofold split in his mentality and in his brain. Two things begin to happen at the exact same time. What I would consider to be a paranoid schizophrenic, or even just a schizophrenic split, begins to happen inside of this character. This is where Humbert really becomes an unreliable narrator, because everything that happens after this is his relationship with Ms. Hayes, as well as the discovery of Lolita and the seduction, at least on his part, from his perspective, of Lolita, or maybe her seducing him, where we're not hugely completely clear on that again. But again, because it comes through his narration, it seems as though he is the driver. Now, Nabokov, and we've already mentioned this before, was a careful, detail-oriented writer. And he did have a love for illusion, for slippery analogies, and he really liked wordplay. As a matter of fact, he liked utilizing French, Russian, and English terms all at the same time, and sometimes in the same sentence, he'll have Humbert switch over that. So it's not easy reading. He'll have Humbert switch in the middle of a sentence to something in French, and you got to go look that up, and then you'll have him switch back to an allusion that's in Russian. And you're like, what the hell are you doing? In order to put together a complete idea. Now, that technique of writing does allow this book to be perceived as however the reader wants it to be perceived. And we already talked about this with context, whether it's in Tehran or New Delhi or Johannesburg or New Jersey, right? Or even Dallas, Fort Worth, Texas, right? But it does make it also the perfect postmodern novel for our postmodern times. Now, there is one thing to note, and it didn't quite land on me until I was almost to the end of the book. And then it sort of landed on me like a ton of bricks because it was obvious in front of my face and I didn't pay attention to it because there's so many other things going on in the book. But Humbert's name is meant to parallel the word humbug, which means deceptive or false talk or behavior. Now, and then, of course, you have Claire Quiltley, which I always think of Claire Quiltley in terms of Stanley Kubrick and the version of Lolita that was directed by him in the 1960s with Peter, what's his name?
Sellers.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, that's right.
Right.
I always think of his. Oh, I don't think of Jeremy Irons. I think of him. That's who pops into my brain. But a humbug is also a flim-flam man. He's also a matchstick man. He's a scammer, right? And particularly in our day, and I already mentioned transhumanism and artificial intelligence, when we are wandering very, very rapidly down a road where we will not know what is the difference between what is real and what is not, or at least we will have to have our senses heightened, particularly in an online environment, about what is real and what is not. Humbert presents a challenge, not presents a challenge, he presents the fact that this has always been a problem in human interactions. Matter of fact, Humbert was such a flim-flam man, he was able to fool Charlotte Hayes. At least all the way up until the end, where she found his diary. By the way, Charlotte Hayes was in a purple haze, kind of like Jimi Hendrix. There's an illusion there, but I can't. I'm linking two things together in my brain. My brain wants to make a connection there. The things are clicking off. So, Claire, what insights can leaders glean from this book, Lolita, about having to engage with an unreliable, a hostile, or even an avoidant narrator? Let's start with that. Hello. So I'm going to do some shilling here, and hopefully this will be a pause in our riveting conversation for you. I have an offer for you. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, the Foundation of Intentional Leadership. It's available in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place you order books. Now, in this book, I address the 12 leadership areas that I have found leaders need to be the most intentional in to be the type of leader followers actually want to follow. From establishing a foundation of leading teams through managing conflict effectively, all the way through leading teams through change, knowing what to do and why to do it can help readers, like the ones listening to this show, become better leaders. Look, reading this book and living it is like getting coaching from me directly without having to pay my full coaching rate. Head on over to leadershiptoolbox.us, that's leadershiptoolbox.us, and scroll down the homepage and click on the Buy Now button to purchase in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle format on Amazon 12 Rules for Leaders, the foundation for intentional leadership. And that's it for me. Now back to the show.
Again, you ask a seemingly simple question just because it's brief, and yet it's incredibly complex. But we did promise at the top of this conversation that we would somehow, some way frame this and tie it back to leadership. I think your characterization of Humbert as an unreliable narrator is so dead on. And I think the parallel there is to the crisis that a lot of leaders do struggle with in terms of not being followable, either because they are not deemed credible, they're not deemed trustworthy, they're not deemed, and I'm not saying every leader, but I do know that a lot of leaders struggle with this. If their team, their peers, their colleagues, their direct reports, their organization does not find something relatable in them, does not find some sort of a human connection, a reflection of their own vulnerability, their own imperfection, then I think this is where leaders go awry, because I think so many leaders mistakenly think they have to project, coming back to the narrative form, this sort of hero complex, right? That they have to be strong and charismatic and without a flaw, and not only wealthy but handsome, and not only visionary but have the plan for executing that. And it's a lot to live up to. I think with Humbert, what was interesting was, from the moment he saw Lolita, and the moment he imprinted on her, she imprinted on him, and he decided this was who he was going to be obsessively in love with. Whether he realized that that's what it was from that first instant or not, I think we kind of figured that out. The rest of the novel, the rest of his life, was spent propping up this hero's journey, that he was going to have this happy storybook life and love relationship with Lolita. And he ended up living on the run for basically the rest of his normal life. And I say normal in quotes, but I mean the life outside of prison.
Mm-hmm.
Really, I mean, there's so much to his character. Like I said earlier, it's too easy to dismiss him as a pedophile, and not understand there are so many intricacies to how deeply flawed he is as a character, but also deeply human and tortured and tormented and manipulative, and yet manipulated by someone who was not, he as you said, he selected Valeria as someone that he felt was his intellectual inferior.
Mm-hmm.
And then he really met his match in
Right.
this young girl. Right. And I sort of, and I'm going to kind of vacillate between that and sort of the leader characteristic. I've known too many leaders, unfortunately, who sort of do the same thing, right? They will hire and they will build a team where they surround themselves, if not with sycophants, at least with people that they perceive to be inferior to them,
Mm-hmm.
either in intellect or in demographic, because they feel threatened if there is even the perception that they are not in total control.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is a built-in characteristic of Humbert. It is why he selected Valeria, to your point. And it's not why he selected Lolita, but I wonder if, because his own emotional maturity was stunted because of this, sort of point at which he had this psychological break that you just described, that was, he couldn't mature past that age of the 12 to 13-year-old or the 9 to 15-year-old. And that was sort of what he was attracted to, because anything above that would challenge his intellect. Maybe. I don't know.
Well, and it's
but he certainly got more than he bargained for.
Oh yeah. I'm reminded of the line from the Amy Mann song from Magnolia back in the 1990s, one of the great ensemble films of the 1990s. You got what you wanted, and now you can hardly stand it.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because, when women read this book, and I have sisters. I was surrounded by strong women. When I was growing up, I married a strong woman. I've been led by women. when women read this book, I definitely get the sense that they take Humbert's measure and dismiss him, kind of like in the Bible, right? The book of Daniel, right? Uh, you know, the measure has been taken and you've been found wanting, right? When men read this book, there's usually the breakdown among, there's usually two different breakdowns. It's either, that's really interesting. That guy's a pervert. You stay the hell away from my daughter and don't talk to me. And I won't cross the street to bother you. You don't cross the street to bother me. Or it's, I'm going to go out and save Lolita. I'm going to save her from him. I'm going to be the white knight. So you have the white knight or you have the stay the hell over there. Now, me, and by the way, that breaks down into how it's a broad generalization for how men break down, I think, on reading this book. And by the way, women don't usually know this because some of men's behavior is opaque to women, right? Because we just don't behave in the same way that women do, right? Around things, or around other people. And so when I read about Humbert, my first thought is not, I'm going to save Lolita. My first thought is that pervert better get the hell across the street or he's going to have a grown man problem with me. By the way, it was the same kind of thought that I had when I read about Harvey Weinstein. There's an apocryphal story about Harvey Weinstein that during the time he was running Miramax, and again, I don't know if it's true. I only heard it once and it stuck with me. That's the only reason I'm repeating it now. You can go Google it and see if I'm wrong. But what's her name? Brad Pitt was married to what's her name? Gwyneth Paltrow at the time. And Gwyneth Paltrow was trying to get into Shakespeare in Love. That's what it was. And everybody knew who Harvey was, right? Everybody knew what Harvey was at the time. And apparently Brad Pitt, who didn't need Harvey Weinstein at the time to get a job. I mean, he'd been in Thelma and Louise, right? And he was kind of coming up. I think he was on the cusp of either he'd done Fight Club or he was on the cusp of doing Fight Club. So he was already an established actor, right? He didn't need Harvey for anything, right? Apparently, Harvey, because Harvey was a known quantity around town, was like sniffing around with Paltrow, and Brad Pitt directly threatened him. Like, you touch her, I'm gonna run you over with my car. And then after I get out of jail and you get out of the hospital, I'm gonna take out my car, I'm gonna run you over again. How about that, Harvey? And by the way, Harvey never, out of all the women that Harvey never touched Gwyneth Paltrow. Now that's a variation of the sort of white knight thing, but it's also a variation of that first part, which is if I see you, you and me are going to have a problem. Otherwise, go over there.
Yeah.
When women hear that, they see the white knight part. When men hear that, they hear the, okay. When I read Lolita and I hear about Humbert, I go, that guy's a scammer and a con artist. And he's got to go. I don't care if he's emotionally immature. I don't really care. I don't care. He's 6'4" or 6'2" and 190 pounds. All the emotional immaturity can go away. You're a grown man. I don't really care. Like, I don't care what's going on in your deep psychology of like whatever. Go stop, right? And so it's interesting that you bring up the point of how do you engage with a hostile or unreliable narrator in terms of the psychological break. I find that to be very interesting because as a man reading this, I just go, well, you're just a liar. Like, you're just lying to yourself. And I don't have to be involved with your lie. Just keep your lie over there. I want separation from your lie, right? I just want separation from it. Go over there. You're going to harm people. Maybe some other dude over there can take care of the problem. Because if I have to take care of it, it's going to be a lot of paperwork. There's going to be cops. It's going to be a lot. It's going to be a lot.
So this is really interesting. And I'm so glad you went there because it was very insightful, the two sort of male reactions to this story. My reaction to it was a little bit of what you just said about Harvey Weinstein, which was everybody knew. You didn't say everybody knew who Harvey Weinstein was. Like, he was a bigwig. You said everyone knew what he was.
Correct. That's right. Just like Jeffrey Epstein, by the way. Everybody knew what Jeffrey Epstein was too.
100%.
No one going to the boat or to the helicopter was fooled from Bill Gates all
Right.
the way to Donald Trump to whoever. None of them were fooled.
No. Yeah, because they were fooled so much they went back. Repeat. Yeah, we're not right.
Like,
So
who are we fooling here, right?
exactly. So here's sort of the I think the two female reactions that I had through the book. One was I was trying desperately to find some humanity in this guy.
Mm-hmm.
Not because I wanted to accept him, but because I had to live alongside of him for the duration of the narrative.
Sure.
Right. But the other was, I think as women, we see this sort of entitlement, this white male wealthy privilege, that he was born, he was very similar to Nabokov himself, right?
Right.
He was born not in dire straits. This was not Slumdog Millionaire, right?
No.
He walked in by nature of his birth into a place of power, and he wielded it. And he never really owned it. He made the narrative, his version of events was entirely from his point of view, his side of the story. And he did it in such a way where he locked it down until after he and Lolita had died, so that if anyone could repudiate what he said, he wasn't going to be around anyway. Right. And so there's this sort of visceral reaction I have as a woman when I read that, and I say, I can't have the same reaction that you can of, either I'm going to go run you over with my car. Well, sure I can. Like, my car is decent and I'm sure it would survive hitting him twice, but
yeah, it'd be fine.
The point being, as the man, you have this protector thing, and you have this, you better stay over there. And as long as you do that, we're fine. As a woman, I see that this is another man of power and privilege who didn't really do anything to earn that position other than be born white and wealthy. And we as women, not as victims, I want to be really clear here. I'm not going down but we're victims. We're not. But we've accepted that there are men in positions of power that we have to live alongside for the duration of the narrative.
Right. Okay.
Right. So from a woman reading that, it's, this guy is flawed. Sure, there's a vulnerability to him, and he can't help the way he is because he's emotionally stunted or he had a mental break or what have you. And I'm trying to find something in him to be okay with his behavior, even to the point where I said earlier, she was kind of like a sick puppy. Like, she sort of manipulated him, but.
Okay. So it's interesting. So two things come out of that. So
right.
First, you use the word, you use the term white male privilege a couple of times here. And that is definitely, like I said, a postmodern framing for this, which works for this particular narrative. Right. And I guess if I were to use that framing in that narrative, or that framing for this narrative, I have and I don't really like the term privilege, but I'll use it because it's the one we're using now. I have the privilege, or maybe it's not even the privilege. I look upon it as the responsibility or the accountability, but let's say privilege of being able to remove that man anytime I want. Like, to me, any man is gettable anywhere. It's just a matter of time and money. Like, that's really it. It's just a matter of time and money. And I'm not threatening anybody. This is just a thing that men walk around in their heads with.
That's why I find this so interesting, because that is extremely insightful that you share that, because that is an instinctive male reaction to that, to be like, if you're doing something that I don't like, I can either take you out or eliminate you from my view. Right. Most women, it's like, have you walked around a corporate workplace? Like, a lot of times, like, they're paying your salary. And I'm not saying everywhere, and I'm not saying all leaders, and that's not my sort of labeling, but there is a reality there. The Harvey Weinsteins of the world are there.
Correct. Well, and then the other dynamic in there, which leads to another question, is this. So Humbert is the villain. Sure, Humbert's the villain. Although maybe Lolita's the villain too. Maybe it's a story of two villains.
And I'm open to that possibility.
Right? Which we're going to get into. I'm going to get into Lolita in a minute. The man's reaction to Lolita. I'm going to get into that in a second here. But let's say that Humbert is the villain. Okay. One of the things I'm a huge fan of the show on Netflix, Mindhunter. I think that show is brilliant. It's a David Fincher show. It's genius. I wish Netflix would do more episodes of that because it effectively explores the spiritual break that occurred in America that led to the development of serial killers. Because we didn't, I'm not gonna say we've never had serial killers, but the concept or the idea of people living in community enough to be able to be close enough to kill each other, or even weirdly enough to get it into their heads to go into another community and do that and act as a predator. And that only happens after industrialization and after World War II. And it effectively shows, that show does, what the psychological and spiritual break was in the country. There was something that got broken in America that allowed that to occur. Right. And that's just the presence of the serial killer or the serial killer mindset, that narcissistic, sociopathic mindset. In my opinion, and watching a show like Mindhunter is the backwash from that spiritual break. And the show does an excellent job of looking at how the FBI behavioral unit was caught completely by surprise that these kinds of folks were even showing up because they were straitjacketed by J. Edgar Hoover morality in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s, and somewhat in the 70s, and really had to struggle to get out of that to go to a different place. But one of the things you get from Mindhunter, or if you've ever watched a movie where, like, the Joker, anti-hero, right? Which has now become the anti-hero after he's been spun off from Batman. The Joker is a sociopath. Like, let's be very clear on this, right? The Heath Ledger version, which is the second best Joker, by the way, ever done. Jack Nicholson is the first in these two of the movies. Leave TV over there. But Heath Ledger says in The Dark Knight, he says, as the Joker, I'm like a dog with a car. I'm just chaos. Like, if I caught a car, I wouldn't know what to do with it. I have no interest in any of that. I'm out here just doing stuff. Or when he sets fire to the half of the money from the mobster, he's like, all you all care about is money. So here, I'm going to set fire to my half. I like things like gasoline and bombs and bullets, things that are cheap. That's what I like. You only care about money. And it's not about money. It's about sending a message. Okay. He thought he was the hero. The villain, and I'm saying all that to say this, the villain, whether it's in Mindhunter or in a movie, the villain, or even in this book, the villain thinks he's the hero. I'm always curious because I never get a chance to ask women this, but I'm going to ask you because you happen to be here. How do you perceive that idea where the villain sees themselves as the hero? They don't think they're doing anything wrong. They just think that they're operating in reality according to the rules of the narrative.
I mean,
and by the way, they're villainous women too. I'll leave Harley Quinn. I'll leave that aside for just a minute. But like, just like that, Humbert didn't think there was anything wrong with him.
Right.
He thought there was something wrong with society. Society was screwed up. He was fine.
Yes. Well, that's my underlying issue with him. It's not that he had these deviant thoughts or even that he acted on them. It was the fact that he never accepted accountability for that.
But he didn't think he needed to.
Well, I don't know. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he didn't. But to come back to your question, sure. Yeah. I think the villains, everyone has a rationale for what they do. Everyone.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Serial killers have a rationale for what they do.
Yeah.
Right. We romanticize the mafia. Why do you think mob movies are so popular and entertaining? Joe Pesci is fantastic to watch, and so is De Niro and Ray Liotta and all of these guys, because we romanticize those villains. Mm-hmm. And if you ask them, they're not the bad guys. They are actually formed out of protecting those who could not go to the police.
Ray Liotta said that in Goodfellas. That's right.
Yes, he did.
As Henry Hill. That's right. That's what the FBI could never understand. We were just like cops for guys who couldn't go to the cops.
Wise guys. That's right. That's right.
That's right. Which, I mean, he's not wrong. So one of the interesting shows, we always talk about cinema somehow on this podcast, but one of the more interesting shows that kind of explores this is The Wire. Like on The Wire, particularly in the first, third, and fourth seasons. Fourth season goes to the educational system, and that one's really heartbreaking. But it's it shows how both the drug dealers and the cops are involved in this system. And the game is the game. And the people who understand that it's the game, by the way, they're the people who get the furthest. Like Omar, right? When Omar testifies, and he was the character, I've talked about him before on this podcast, but in The Wire, he's the character who robs other drug dealers, right? And he comes down the street with a trench coat and a shotgun, and he'll put a shotgun in a drug dealer's face and take his money. And all the drug dealers, all the corners, when Omar comes, they all scream, Omar's coming, and then they drop their drugs and run, right? Because he wants to get a shotgun in your face, right? And you don't live very long. And by the way, this was based on a real character that lived in Baltimore who actually did rob drug dealers, which is insane, right? Just absolutely nuts. And to have a legend like that, where people just yell out your name before you show up, that's like Batman level stuff. But my point is, when he was called to testify, well, he was using the system of the judicial system to testify against his enemies and have them locked up. And the lawyer on the other side basically said, you're a villain. Why should we believe anything that you say? And he goes, well, you're a villain too. I rob people with a shotgun. You rob them with a suitcase. And the defense attorney turned so quick on his heel, you would have think he was shocked. Because here's what happens. We have these rationales and all these acceptable systems, like the judicial system or the marriage system. I mean, Humbert tries to civilize himself by getting married to Charlotte Hayes. And it doesn't work because the system can't civilize that guy. But he does make a good faith effort, I think, anyway. He made a good faith effort, such as it was inside of him to be able to do.
I think it was a good faith effort to project normalcy to the outside world.
Everything's got mixed motives. That comes out of NYPD Blue as well. Everything's mixed, a mixture of nothing's pure, right?
Right.
I wish it were pure. I wish the villain had pure motives.
Right.
Just like I wish the hero had.
You and I both know he married Charlotte to be closer to Lolita.
Of course.
A built-in reason to be near her. And then, of course, Charlotte got wind of that and shipped her off to summer camp. So.
Which, by the way, got wind of that, weirdly enough, not through anything he said, and not through anything but mostly through what, and this, now we're going to switch to the female dynamic here.
Yeah.
Through Lolita's behavior towards Humbert. Now, this is an area where I have been looking at women and studying women for the last 45 years, and I'm completely opaque. I can't figure out what's going on in that side of the door. No idea.
I know. We do that on purpose to you guys. It's like okay. It's girl code, but go on.
No, that's fine. I'm not asking you to reveal anything.
I can't. It's like it's a club. I can't do it. I swear.
That's fine. All right, that's fine. God forbid I figure out what's going on behind that door. But but you look at this and the dynamic between the mother and the daughter.
Yeah.
Where there's a competition for well, let's just be blunt. There's a competition for sexual attention or sexual attraction, right? Or just attraction in general. It's not, maybe not, I mean, sexual is too hard a term. Let's say it's just competition for attraction, where the mother believes that she is not nearly as attractive to Humbert as her daughter is. She senses that that's happening, but she doesn't want to say it out loud. She doesn't want to put a pin directly in that part of the map. Instead, she's like the Klingons in Wrath of Khan. Not the Klingons, Khan in Wrath of Khan, trying to chase after Shatner. She hits everybody else except for Shatner. Like she's going all the way around the target. And finally, in sort of desperation, she sends Lolita off to this camp. And I look at that as a man, and to me, I'm like, why didn't you just confront him directly? But that doesn't happen. As a matter of fact, she's so deep into the idea, delusion's a hard word, the idea that he's in love with her, that she gets married to him, and then is surprised after she discovers that her target was correct, her targeting were correct. And then and by the way, I thought this was a cheap get out of jail free card part on Nabokov's part.
Yeah.
Like, really? She's going to get hit by a car crossing the
I
street.
want to come back to that because
Yeah,
like
go ahead.
he's incredibly lucky throughout the whole thing. But first the point about Charlotte. I don't think she ever deluded herself into thinking that he had fallen in love with her. I think that to your point about why didn't she just confront him? I think women don't confront men with a question like that because they are afraid of the answer. And she was competing with a younger version of herself, a younger, thinner, beautiful version of herself. That as long as she was in the picture, daughter or no, there was competition for the sexual attention of a man. And so, as long as she didn't ask him, are you in love with me like I'm in love with you? She didn't have to feel that rejection. So, I think that's why she never confronted him. But yes, let's go back to how incredibly lucky this bastard was throughout the entire narrative because she was about to shatter his not only the outward appearance that he was a normal, domesticated, married, faithful husband. And she goes out to, because she's going to mail a letter because, back then you couldn't tweet about what a
Or send
philanderer
an email.
was. Right, exactly. So, like, whatever. And then problem removed. And I love, by the way, because leading up to that for a couple of chapters, he's again fantasizing because, like the author, he has to just sort of fantasize because he'll never actually go through with it, killing her.
Right.
And there was a quote. I wrote it down because I actually like there's so much language in this book that does make it worth the read. And he said something like, "Nowadays you have to be a scientist if you want to be a killer."
Right.
Which
yes.
I thought was brilliant, right? And so, like, as much as he was sort of lamenting the fact that he absolutely didn't love her, felt trapped, he only married her to get closer to Lolita, but knew he would never go through with poisoning or otherwise.
Right.
She bails him out by getting so irate and so, irrational that she gets hit by a car. And then but the rest of the book as well. How many times did they come close to being discovered? Him and his nymphette, and he's never discovered. Not really. I mean, by Q, but like,
well, yeah, by Q, right? Who played by Peter Sellers in the 1962 film. And then, of course, when I think of, weirdly enough, and this is the imprint of the film, which I've only actually watched, I think, once. I don't even think I made it through all of it because it was Kubrick, and I'm like, I gotta walk away.
You have to really be in the mood for him, yeah.
Yeah. Shelley Winters, the great Shelley Winters, right? And so that's the image I have in my head of this woman who, and he describes her as being frumpy or whatever. And Shelley Winters was a beautiful woman, quite frankly. But Kubrick did a really good job of sort of frumping her up and making her more
Poseidon adventure than yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And you definitely get the sense that. And Sue Lyon, of course, was playing Lolita in her film debut. I don't think she really did much after that. Again, you run into the buzzsaw known as Stanley Kubrick, and you got to be. Peter Sellers was the only one who could sort of navigate that because he kind of had a career before Kubrick. But I think of Shelley Winters, and I think of that visual of her and Sue Lyon sort of competing for this gentleman's attentions. And by the way, Humbert, I didn't think in terms of James Marsden. Really weird, or James Mason, I'm sorry. I really didn't think of him. James Marsden, that guy played Cyclops.
I'm like, was there a new version? Okay.
Right. No. Yeah, the guy played Cyclops. No. And I didn't think of him in terms of Jeremy Irons, weirdly enough, either.
Yeah.
He's just sort of this cutout in my brain where any like weirdo dude could fit in. Like any weirdo gamma dude could fit in.
Yeah,
I don't really think
he wasn't in focus for you.
Yeah, and it was really weird for me because I could see the competition aspect that you were talking about. But I've always been, I'll frame it this way. Does the competition aspect make, if this book had been written by Charlotte Hayes, would the competition aspect with her daughter be the frontline thing, and whatever the hell's happening with Humbert be the back end thing, the thing riding in the back of the bus? Like, how does that And it's, I mean, it's an interesting thing. I don't think anybody's tried to do that, because that's a real tough sort of twist to kind of make. I think another towering intellect could probably do it. I'm not that person to do it. Don't look to me if you're listening and this is a book idea. I'm just giving this one away. Sure, just go ahead and do it. Because I don't know. Or maybe we've already had that book or that movie already out there. And the reason why I'm framing this way is because we now live in a world where, for better or worse, and I mentioned OnlyFans and I mentioned Instagram and I mentioned pornography already. Um, Pornography specifically is about the third largest search driver on the internet after like sports and news. And we don't like to talk about that out loud, but there's always two parts to pornography. There's the person watching it, and there's the person performing it, or the people performing it. And we live in a world where agency and freedom, we live in a country where agency and freedom is now our capital G God. And as long as you're, and obviously I'm taking out the child sex trafficking stuff, I'm taking out that, but there are people who are sex trafficked as adults into that, right? And we look at that and we go, oh, they're being robbed of their agency, but nobody's seriously talking about banning pornography. None of the women, I've never even heard of the women in pornography talking about banning pornography. There's a dynamic there that I don't understand. And I particularly don't understand it in light of, what are we on to now? Fourth wave feminism. Now, I don't understand what's happening in the female gender around that. And forget the turf stuff and trans this and trans that. Put all that to the side. That's an offshoot that's over there. I'm talking specifically about this idea of female agency inside of competition for male attention. Like, this is, and that's why I don't think this book lands nearly as hard, at least in our context. It lands in different contexts, other places harder. But here now in our time, we've got a lot of different opposing dynamics going on in our culture about female agency. So where on the one hand, we have no problem with a woman doing whatever it is she's going to do on OnlyFans with, by the way, a dude filming her, by the way. Usually 90% of that is what is happening there. And then she makes money off of selling like her bath water on the internet. And we go, oh, that's disgusting. I mean, this actually happened. Oh, that's disgusting. But no one's going and taking away her bathwater money. No one's saying, oh, you should do something different than OnlyFans. No one is saying that. We're like, oh, she has freedom. She has agency. She can go do that. And yet, you're all still competing, even with the bathwater thing. You're still competing for male attention, because who's buying the bathwater? It ain't my wife.
Well, because it comes back to this stereotyped image of the American male, that he cannot be blamed for his raw animal sexual drive, because men are sexual animals, and they have,
I think if we weren't in the backwash of Me Too, I would agree with that. But we're in the backwash of Me Too. I would have agreed with that maybe in 2010.
Yeah, but so it's interesting because there's Me Too, which is all around sexual harassment.
Sure.
There's human trafficking, which is abominable and still a thing. And needs more attention than it's being given, because it's sort of like, well, but Jeffrey Epstein, he's whatever, he's rich and he has his own plane, so that makes it okay,
right?
So there's those two things. But on the other side, we have pornography, and we have prominent in the news women who have been in the oldest profession in the world, who are taking back their power in a manner of speaking, right?
Right.
So there's
this is all these conflicting threads.
Yeah. Did you wait? We didn't know where we were going to go with this conversation, but it's like you as we said before you hit record. How are we going to talk about this book without talking about sex? Like, you have to talk about it. Well, I don't know many people that are going to watch this episode necessarily in our own families, but we have to talk about the things that are There's a reason this book is still considered one of the all-time classics.
Because it opens up a can of worms that, again, I keep going back to this word uncomfortable, or we don't want to. It is that. We don't want to open up this can of worms. And by the way, when the book was originally written in the 1950s, right? I think the culture, particularly the gatekeepers of the culture, understood two things. One, they were the gatekeepers of the culture, for good or ill, whether we agree with them in 2024 or not. They understood they were the gatekeepers of the culture. And then number two, they understood that by guarding the gates and holding the keys, you had a certain amount of responsibility to the people who were behind that to keep things out. Thus, you get the idea of, I don't know what pornography is, but I know it when I see it. Thus you get the idea of moralities clauses that were in contracts, particularly even in the NFL going into the early 2000s, they started dropping those.
Yeah.
You've already talked about obliquely, you mentioned gay marriage, but I mean, Oberfell, that's 2010, 2012, somewhere around there. Right. So, on the one hand, we can progressively lament the fact that our culture isn't more, I don't know, open, but on the, and because two things can be true at once, not but, and we have an incredibly open culture, and it's not open about, and this is the hard part, it's not open about the emotional and psychological damage that goes along with these things, because if it were open about that, maybe Lolita doesn't get written.
There it is.
Or if it does get written, maybe it's like, okay, we rewrote that. That's done. We see no need to repeat that. Matter of fact, we're going to use this as a case study of what not to do. And then, of course, that bumps up against freedom of speech and artistic license and artistic expression.
And then you said before, we were kind of sharing, like, as a man reading this book, you sort of had these two reactions. As a woman reading this book, I had a couple of reactions as well. There's also the what the author gets out of it and what the audience gets out of it, right? There's the as we sort of talked about, the author of this and the author of most fiction uses this as a creative outlet. It's the whole
right.
The whole point. So do painters and sculptors and all creative people. This is a form of expression, yes, but it's not just, oh my gosh, this story is going to be a bestseller. There's no way you can tell me Nabokov ever would have imagined that we would be talking about this book in 2024.
Oh,
there's no way. When he wrote it, maybe by the time he died and he went, wow, this like, people really like the book. It's not that they like the book. It's, to your point, the book forces us to get comfortable with uncomfortable conversations. But I think there's also these great books. That's the reason you term this podcast great books. Every single one of them is also a mirror to the society, right? So as much as the content, the storyline, the subject matter of this particular book is uncomfortable and at times creepy and a little bit icky, it's not an explicit book.
No, it's weirdly not explicit.
It is like bizarrely not explicit. And we can talk about the Kubrick version, and he filmed it in London to kind of get over some of that stuff. But the reality is, the reason it has staying power is because it is a reflection in some degree of the society at the time then and of the society now.
Well, maybe, or is it a sign, because it is bizarrely not explicit? Like, there's absolutely, I won't say there's absolutely, beyond a couple of things,
right,
there's nothing explicit in here.
No.
It's the psychological. It's like, to go back to Stephen King for just a minute, most of Stephen, not his early writing, but like his mid-career, mid-80s, past Tommyknockers into like the mid-90s writing, his mid-career or early mid-career, most of the stuff that he wrote there was horror, don't get me wrong, like It, okay, I'll throw It in there, okay, it was horror for sure, and there are things that happen in It that are horrific, but the vast majority of that book, I would say 90% of it, is just operating on your brain. It's the door slamming in the dark. It's letting your imagination.
Hitchcock's Psycho.
Exactly.
The
Right.
shower scene.
That's right. Or
Our
Chekhov's
mind
gun.
filled in the blanks of a
Right.
stabbing we never saw.
Exactly. Correct.
Right?
Or Chekhov's gun, right? The idea that Anton Chekhov had that if you have a gun in the first, chapter of your
It will be
of your
fired
book, of
with.
your play,
Yes.
you got to
Yes.
fire it at some point. And of
Right.
course, Hemingway messed with that because he's like, I'm just gonna leave the gun here and screw you,
Well, he was
Chekhov.
kind of an ass. I mean,
He was. But it does operate. Lolita does operate all inside your head.
Mhm.
So I'm not quite sure that if my no, I used to work with college students, right? And there are some 19 and 20-year-olds I worked with back in the day that if I gave this to them, or that they would even get all the illusions in it. Matter of fact, I'm pretty sure they would have given up on it. Like, I think this is a really hard book to, particularly these days. Like, and I worked with young people 15 years ago. Like, now, I don't know how you teach a Lolita to the TikTok generation. I don't know how you do it. I don't know. And it's not an attention span issue. It's a challenge of every single thing that can be imagined that was the mortar holding the bricks together of this narrative is now already explicit. You can go get it. Just do a Twitter search.
Right.
You can go get it. Just go do an OnlyFans search. Just go do an Instagram Reel search. Just go doing and whatever your pornography is of choice search. You just go get it while you're walking to class on your cell phone. So, we don't use the word obscenity anymore in our culture. We really don't. We don't kind of, it's one of those anachronistic words that even sounds weird coming out of my mouth. Like, oh, that's obscene. People are like, what are you talking about? Like, it catches people by surprise, right?
Yeah. Right.
And obscenity is often tied to power relationships. And so we kind of wandered from the relationships between Dolores and Lolita and Charlotte, right? The mother and the the daughter and the mother, the mother and the daughter, that dynamic, to this world of, to your point, sex trafficking and these other kinds of areas that we seem to have a lot of agency on in our time, but we would not have talked about out loud back then because we knew what was obscene. How do we identify obscenity in our cultural moment? Like, what's or even at a more base level? I'm going to ask you what seems like a simple question, but it's actually complicated yet again. What is merely salacious versus what's free speech? Like, is everything free speech? And I'm a free speech guy, by the way. I'm a free speech partisan.
Well, right. as am I. And it's sort of there's a couple of I would want to understand the context to your question, right? Because if we're talking within the realm of leadership and, corporate society, that's sort of one question. The society at large.
Well, I don't think that
normal discourse, right? I mean,
but I think the cultural society and corporate society are bleeding together.
They are.
And the reason why I say this is when you have people putting black squares on Instagram because George Floyd died in 2020, and it's corporations, right? Or you have, and it was toned down a little bit this year, which is interesting across social media, but you see corporate support for gay pride in June. Okay. Or you see entertainment where certain sociocultural messages are inserted, and it's no longer subtle. It used to be subtle. They've always been inserting sociocultural messages into entertainment, but now it's just like blah, like you can see it, right? You don't have to search for it, right? The corporate entities behind entertainment, behind finance, behind even big pharma, right? Okay. They're taking social stands on things. And then they're asking or forcing, depending upon your perspective, their customers to either align with them or not. Two big examples. One more recent and one in the background that I always think of. Tractor Supply, right? The tractor company, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have no idea what all the ins and outs were of this particular story. All I know is how it ended. Well, Tractor Supply's, quite frankly, its clients, its customers, not clients, its customers are, to your point earlier, to use the language that you use, they are white guys. They're white farmers in America and other places, but mostly in America. And most Tractor Supplies are in rural, majority white areas. Well, when Tractor Supply comes out and says, we're going to hire more women, minorities, we're going to do whatever, right? We're going to go woke is the term that's used. There's going to be pushback from their customers. Now, Tractor Supply, weirdly enough, which most organizations have not done this, they usually go hard in the opposite direction. I'm looking at you, Bud Light. They go away from their audience. Well, they go away from their audience, they go away from their base, and they go hard in the opposite direction because they're appealing to they're trying to chase a different audience segment at a corporate level because it's about making money. Tractor Supply goes, oh, wait, it'd probably be a really good idea for us to stick with the folks who are actually paying us money. And so they reversed themselves. That was more recently. Now, a few years ago, this was back during 2021, actually, when no, it was 2020 because I was teaching. We did a case study about Red Bull in my business school class. And Red Bull's a German company, and they had hired a bunch of DEI folks to like do stuff in HR or whatever and do trainings across Red Bull when everybody was doing that in response to George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis. And during the semester when we were studying the case study of Red Bull, and we know what Red Bull is, like it's, extreme sports, it's guys doing stupid things like taking a parachute through a wind tunnel, like for no reason, like doing ridiculous things, right? Or jumping off of a cliff with a motorbike. Like who's doing this, right?
It's adrenaline, right? It's
adrenaline junkies,
yep.
Right?
Yep.
The president of Red Bull came out during that year and said, you know what? We're Germans. We don't know what the hell is happening in America. And I'm just paraphrasing here, but we're firing all of our DEI people. And we're closing the department because it doesn't match our brand and no one cares who likes our Red Bull. No one cares. They were right, by the way. No one cared. Red Bull didn't like take a hit. They went hard in the opposite direction, right? They went all the way over there. So the reason I push back is because corporations are making these kinds of cultural choices, and they are asking their customers to make a decision. Are you in or out? And by the way, some customers are like, we're out. And then they go form Black Rifle Coffee because they don't want to buy Starbucks, right? They're like, we're the anti-Starbucks and we don't care. And they go hard in that direction.
Yep.
And then the other folks stay and push that corporation in a different direction, like the aforementioned Starbucks. Okay. Yep. Now, I don't know if that's a good or bad. Again, I'm merely pointing out data points that I see. Yep. So when you say leadership and free speech in a corporate setting is different than it is in a social, I don't think so. I think those two things are merging together.
They're merging. The lines are blurring. But within corporate, what I certainly see is leaders and organizations struggling with how free is free, specifically around the political landscape that we are in. Right.
Yes, we are in an election year.
Well, no, I mean, but no, I feel like we've been in an election year since 2016. Like,
let's be
honest. But right. Yeah. But I mean, but I think leaders and teams and organizations are struggling with the yes, we want people to feel comfortable, bring their authentic selves to work and all of this. We want to create psychological safety and everything else. But I do think when they say that, they are also saying that free speech has limits, meaning that while we want you to vote whatever way you want to vote, what we don't want you to do is bring your polarizing political hate speech, if that's what it ends up being for either side, into the workplace, because that's a distraction that takes us off our mission.
But how does that work
when the container matters?
But how does that work when this is a question I wanted to ask a lot of guests. I'm going to ask you. You wrote the book Grow on Purpose, so I'm going to ask you because you should know, or maybe you don't know. Maybe this is a question for you too. Here's a follow-up to that. Politics has replaced religion. we now get our public morality from politics. We can see this everywhere, by the way. We make moral judgments about who people are by how they vote. This is part of the great sorting that's going on in America right now.
Yeah, you're right.
It's even broken down into, and I didn't anticipate COVID, but I should have anticipated something like that coming along that would have forced a sorting. And post-COVID, we've seen more and more at a geographical level, people migrating to, I'm going to go to this place where I can work for a corporation and I can show up and talk about who I voted for the way I would talk about what church I go to, and no one's going to look at me weird. Blue or red, and by the way, the areas that are purple, God bless all of you, my folks in Colorado or Arizona. God bless all of you. You haven't sorted out fully yet. You just haven't.
It's gonna
happen. You're gonna sort.
Right. Yet is the key word there. Yep.
Yet is the key word, right? It may take 15 or 20 more years, but you're gonna sort.
Yep.
Now, I don't know. Again, I don't know if that sorting is good or bad. I just know it's happening. We can discuss if it's good or bad, and Jonathan Haidt and many other researchers have ideas on it being good or bad. And of course, the continued, which I'm in favor of, the continued cohesiveness of the republic is very important to me. Very important to me. But when politics replaces religion as where people find their morality, not identity, that's a different thing, but their morality.
Right.
I think corporate leaders are in a real bind there.
Yes, they are.
And I'm not going to say I don't know what the answer is, because we are going to explore some solutions here, turning the corner. I have some ideas of what the solution might be. There are some examples of corporations who have said you need to leave your morality at home, which means leave your politics at home. Interesting. I think that's one direction we could potentially explore. But that makes everybody who wants to have their morality displayed as their identity less than happy, let us say. In case in point, by the way, the protesters that were protesting the Israeli-Gaza war at Google, right? Going to somebody's office and protesting. By the way, all 21 of those folks got fired, which I think is the correct move, by the way, for Google. Why are you showing up in some supervisor's office protesting and laying out and raising signs? What are we doing?
Yeah.
You got to go. And by the way, Google, I think, handled it poorly, where they did an internal Slack channel, thinking that the internal Slack channel would allow people, would allow people to blow off all the steam.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah. Would allow people to blow off all the steam, and then they could tamp it down on there. And the problem is, and I've said this already on the podcast, our online morality and our online behavior and communication styles, we've now had 15 to 20 years of this, are now bleeding out into real life.
Yep.
Which is a real problem, particularly with the politics of religion polarization. So what do leaders do with that? And that is, by the way, one of the circular challenges we've had on this podcast. I've asked many different folks this question in different types of ways in the context of different types of books. But in particular with a book like this, where it is very postmodern and we don't really know what the truth is in here. We know there's something morally icky in here, but we may not have the language to describe why it's morally icky. We just know that it is. But it's not morally icky in the way that climate change is morally icky, or social justice or social injustice is morally icky. It's morally icky in a different kind of way. So what do leaders do with that dynamic? How do they handle that? And you already mentioned what is free and what's the limits of freedom, but we don't place limits on freedom, right?
Well, tell that to the 20-odd Google employees that are now collecting unemployment, right, for expressing free speech. So because people in your audience also, there are going to be at least a subset who go, well, wait a second, you just reversed yourself. You agreed with that decision, but you said free speech shouldn't have limits, right?
Right.
Because we live in a time where ambiguity about what is the right thing to do and how much do we legislate the lives of our employees. That's always been a question, but now the goalposts are shifted. To your point, it's no longer religion is the taboo subject, it's politics. And unfortunately, technology or not, even though we have a 24/7 news cycle, news in big quotes, because it depends, whatever, we still don't get instant feedback on what is the right decision.
Right.
Just like as soon as Nabokov published this book,
Mm-hmm.
he didn't know that it was going to be this phenomenon, this classic all these years later. He wanted to burn it down.
Mm-hmm.
And his wife, again, we should probably do some research on her psyche. That's for another time. But I think, even the climate that we're in, and I referenced 2016, when this sort of the first election that was a little bit like, this is going to be different.
Mm-hmm.
Even though every other election, I think we've always said that, but like we're in a different era, but we're still within it. And I think it's going to take us getting through whenever this era is going to phase out again, to have some benefit of historical hindsight to say, what of this? COVID is sort of the easy one,
Mm-hmm.
right? COVID is really easy to say as we were living in it and as we were in lockdown. This is an unprecedented thing, right? This is a once in a generation experience that we're whatever. But the political cycles and the polarization and the morality that's now defined by your political party or who you vote for or whatever, I don't know that we're going to know the right thing to do as leaders like the day after we do it. I really don't. I think we're going to have to look back and say, yeah, we took a hit on that. We didn't on this, just like you said with Tractor Supply.
Right.
That example that they kind of reverted back to what was true for them. And I think the lesson for them in some of those examples is, were you shifting what you're going to come out publicly and say your culture is all about because you want to dial back into what is core to your mission and your vision and your values, or because you want to chase the money?
Right.
And that is a very polarizing decision.
Right.
Because it's not both. That is not to say that if you're a purpose-driven organization, you can't make a profit. There are actually studies that prove that purpose-driven organizations, I think, are like 12 times more profitable.
Right.
That's not what I'm saying. But in the examples that you gave, I think, Red Bull is a perfect example of, they didn't chase the money. They said, wait a second, what we're really all about is this core thing. And DE&I doesn't really like prop us up in any sort of way to call it out. It doesn't mean that we're going to discriminate. It just means we're not going to like set up a department called DE&I.
Right.
And for them, it wasn't about, we're going to make more money if we come out publicly and say DE&I is not a thing for us. What they were saying was, we don't care about any of that. What we care about is staying true to us and true to our brand.
Well, and in the world of instant feedback that social media gives you, when an organization, let's say, I mean, it's easy to pick on DEI, so let's pick on ESG, right? Let's pick on BlackRock for just a minute, okay? So Larry, I believe his last name is Fink, if I remember correctly, over at BlackRock. I actually watched him one time and doing an interview on the steps of some building somewhere, and he was like, I don't know what all this stuff is, but this is ridiculous. I was like, but it's your company. Like, you go to the meetings. Like, they tell you what it is. Like, stop, Larry. Like, come on, give me a break.
Larry,
Can I tell you, Larry? Come on.
Yeah.
We do get, those corporate leaders do get instant feedback. And by the way, I think this drives political bureaucrats crazy. But I think the second group of people that it drives crazy is the corporate leaders, because it used to be in the world of Mad Men, where I could just make the decision and you're going to eat it. And that's it. But now we live in a space where, yeah, on the political cycle, you're correct. We don't get instant feedback on the decision on the political cycle. That's a little bit more long-term, which, by the way, drives us crazy, because we can get instant feedback the second I drop this podcast episode, or the second I put a blog post out, or the second I send out an newsletter out to my subscribers, or even more instant than that, the second I tweet, right? Or the second I post something on Facebook, right? Or the second I make a video and put it on YouTube. I can get instant feedback in a way that from Johnny Carson to Charles Bukowski couldn't get back in the day. There were cycles where people had to live with the thing that I was making, or live with the decision that I had been promoting as a leader, or live with the outcome of what it is that happened. And they just had to live with it. And by the way, living with it may have meant living with it until the next decision came along, a month or 2 months or whatever. A lot of our organizational behavior research still, weirdly enough, comes out of the 20 years of the Industrial Revolution between the 1950s and the 1970s, right? When people worked with each other for 20 years and had a chance to grow in interpersonal relationships. And we're still, weirdly enough, trying to apply that to now. I don't understand why. We still do that in a lot of different areas. And I get it. Like the psychology stuff is very interesting there. But at the end of the day, the 20-year cycle is done. We're now into a, hey, I'm going to give you feedback right now on Twitter. And by the way, back in the day when I used to tell managers and supervisors that your employees, when they leave, will talk about you on places that you don't know about, they would stare at me like I was crazy. Like I'd grown a third head. And this is, by the way, not in like a backwater place in like Louisiana where I was training at some small business. No. This is in New York City.
Mm.
They would stare at me like I was nuts. I'm like, no, this is happening right now.
That's right.
And this was as late as like 2014. People were verklempt by this. People were like perplexed, right?
Yeah.
Because they didn't understand that, yes, I make the decision as the leader, and then I don't have to listen to the feedback from the peasants. No, the peasants are talking, and they're showing up with the pitchforks.
That's right.
They're showing up in your office at Google. And yeah, Google can, okay, you want to go fast? Let's go fast. You're out.
Right.
But that speed to feedback part works in a lot of other places except for politics. It also works a lot of places except for, I think, historical time frames or historical time cycles. So one of the things I've been doing on this podcast this year is I've been exploring the idea that we're close to the end of the fourth turning. And I don't know if you know the concept of the turnings and all that. Yeah, okay. So it comes out of the ideas of William Strauss and Neil Howe. And they wrote a book back in the mid 1990s called The Fourth Turning. And basically what it does is it describes that, or not describes, it postulates that there are historical cycles that America goes through once every 80 years. And so you'll have a first turning that's sort of 20 years of like a high, right? Where things are happening, everybody's clicking together, it's communitarian, Then you'll have sort of a summer period, another 20 years, where it's not a high, but things are kind of squishy at the edges, but everything still feels pretty solid. Then you immediately dump into a fall period of 20 years. And in that 20 years, everything fragments. You get shows like NYPD Blue, which show the fragmentation. You get events where, Nixon gets fired, or Nixon quits actually. And then Ronald Reagan almost gets shot and almost dies, and history kind of wobbles a little bit. And then like the Berlin Wall falls. Like those things happen during a fragmentation cycle in the West. And then you get into a 20 or 25 year long chaos cycle. And a chaos cycle is where chaos happens literally everywhere: financial, psychological, political, social. I mean, you have breakdowns in community, you have geographical breakdowns, you have pandemics. In the last two historical cycles in America, last two historical 80-year cycles, we had World War II and the Great Depression. And then before that, we had the Civil War. And usually 4 generations, with the exception of the Civil War, 4 generations go through all 4 of the cycles together. So today we have baby boomers who experienced most of their good times in the summer cycle of America and are now perplexed by all the chaos. Then you have Gen Xers who grew up in that fragmentary time or were born during the fragmentary time. Like I'm a young Gen Xer. I grew up during that fragmentary time. Like it's
Same.
And typically those folks tend to be survivors, because when the chaos shows up, they're the people who can be like, oh, there's a fragment there, there's a fragment there, there's a fragment there. Let's just cobble this together. It'll work.
Right. It'll all work out in the end.
Yeah, shoestring and glue, man. It's good.
That's right.
Let's go. Right. And then you have people who are born during the chaos cycle who are protected. That's where you get millennials, who will eventually in the high cycle will become the hero generation. And you get folks like Gen Z, who are the next artistic cycle behind, and are going to create the next summer behind the millennial hero generation. They would be parallel to the late baby boomers in the 1960s. So I've been thinking about this idea. I read The Fourth Turning, had a person on the podcast earlier this year. We talked about this book a lot. And one of the challenges is while the book did not predict 9/11, I believe fundamentally that 9/11 was the beginning of the chaos cycle. It was the end of the fragmentation and the beginning of the chaos cycle, because you can't have a psychological event and political event and cultural event like that happen, and we haven't fully come to grips with that. And it's been literal chaos every 4 or 5 years. I mean, you go from September 11th to Occupy Wall Street to the Tea Party to the 2008 collapse to and you have a couple good years in there, still some fuzzy things happening, the rise of social media. Then you get Donald Trump, and say what you want about him, regardless of whether or not you voted for him, as an irrelevancy. That guy was a disruptor, period, full stop, just opening his mouth, right? And then from there, you get 2020, you get COVID. And now, and by the way, in the fourth turning, Strauss and Howe predicted everything, and almost everything has come to pass that they have predicted, with the exception of the Civil War part. Now, I fundamentally believe that the chaos that started in March of 2020 and went through January of 2021 was our Civil War. I think that was our fourth turnings version of a Civil War, because that was when everything was the sharpest. And the country didn't come apart, but there was definitely like, oh, those people are burning down a police station in Portland every night for 2 months. Maybe I don't want to live there. I can move to Dallas Fort Worth, where they let them protest, but nothing burned down. The cops are just like, get the hell out of here and go home. And everybody got the hell out of there and went home. Like, done, right? Like that was the Civil War. That was it, right? I fundamentally believe on this podcast, and we've been running that this way this year, that through the books that we read, we can find a way, I think, to set up leaders to be effective on the next high. And I do believe another high is coming. As a matter of fact, I think after this next election, this is why this one feels so sharp. It feels so sharp and pointed. Like people talk about 2016 or 2020. This one's really the tip edge of the spear, and everybody can kind of feel it.
Yeah.
If we don't, quote unquote, get it right, whatever that may mean,
right,
we're going to tip in one way or another. By the way, the Trump assassination attempt, that was one of those moments where like history like rattles a little bit. And that's why it caught everybody by surprise, whether you like Trump or not. Everybody knew left political, right. If he goes down, there's another domino that falls after that. And I don't know that you come back from that as a body politic, right? And I'm not being apocalyptic here. This is how people, at least up until about a month later, when Kamala Harris ascended to being Kamala Harris, were talking about this. But those kinds of events, those kinds of world-beating events happen during a chaotic fourth turning cycle. And Strauss and Howe postulated this in their book, and I think they are correct fundamentally. How do we? No. We've talked a lot about a lot of different things: private desires, public ideals, public morality. This book opens up a lot of doors in the floor. We've talked about libertinism without using that word. We've talked about what is freedom. We've talked about the unreliable narrator, lying, the competition between women for men's attention, and the competition between men for, maintaining order, whatever that may mean. How do we take a book like this into a cultural high that's coming on the other side of this? Which, weirdly, by the way, none of us believe is going to happen, but it will. It will if the historical cycle thing is true, because those cycles happen outside of anything we individually do, but collectively we can go in that direction. Can we take this book to a cultural high, or is this book going to just subsume for a while until the next fragmentation shows up?
So this book predates us, right?
Absolutely.
It came out many years before either of us was born, or at least many, I'm going to say many. And yet both of us chose now to read this.
Right.
And sure, we had the excuse of, hey, you and I were going to do a podcast episode together. This is one of the books we could pick. We didn't have to pick this one. We could have, and to your point, I picked it. I said, you know what? Let's go edgy. Let's go with this one. Let's talk about it. But I fundamentally believe that things happen for a reason, and we are put in the path of different things in our life at the time that we are meant to experience them or at least be invited to the opportunity to experience them. And this is one of those. Many, if not most, of your audience will not have read this book.
Yeah.
I hope by now we have convinced them to at least give it a go. Mm-hmm. Because I do see the reason why this book is not long since forgotten. I can understand its staying power, and it's not specific to the subject matter itself. It is because again, as we said, it's not an overly explicit, the content is not explicit. The subject matter is icky. Mm-hmm. But it's subject matter that is still around. Pedophilia is still around. The sexual exploitation of minors, the power struggle between men and women and children and this and that, it is still here. So there are universal themes, not to mention madness and divorce and bad driving that kills Charlotte, just sort of, bailed out Humbert. I think a book like this, if we truly are on the cusp of the fourth turning, is really important. Because, one of the things that stuck with me from our first conversation was the fact that, and I know it's not the first time you've said it, but one of the reasons that you have this particular podcast the way you framed it is because people don't have civil discourse anymore.
Correct. Yeah, they don't.
And I think this is the type of book that mandates it, right? This is the type of book that I don't know of anyone in your audience who's going to read it and go, Humbert's a hero and Humbert's perfect. And, he's my idol. And he's like, there's not going to be the polarization of a book like this. There is going to be there are certain topics we don't discuss. And right. I think this is the type of book that challenges that and says, not only is this a topic we need to discuss, but it's a bridge to other topics. Yeah. You and I have gone so off script on this wonderful conversation, and I've loved every minute of it because of the fact that it isn't just about the book. It's what the book gave us a platform to sort of explore and to inquire about. And I love the fact that you just said this book opens up a lot of doors in the floor. I love that. I don't know if you're quoting someone or if that was you, but it's brilliant because I think it's so true. I think it's not only on the floor, it's under the rug, behind the big furniture, and it's, the part of the house that nobody talks about, but it stores all the treasures. And we've got to open that up and air it out and actually have conversations around things that we're uncomfortable about, because we do live in an era that is chaotic. Yeah. And where it has become, where in certain aspects of our lives, we have felt empowered to talk about things that normally we wouldn't talk about. And in equal measure, silenced around things that are no longer appropriate to bring up. Mm-hmm. And I think this is the type of book that flips that and says, here's a story, and here's a bunch of characters who are all flawed.
Oh my Lord, yes.
I mean, we barely scratched the surface on Lolita. Like, can we talk about her for a minute?
Yeah. She, oof. Oy. Like, well, I mean, we want to talk, I mean, we don't talk about agency in children. Yeah. So I think about it in a Christian context. I'll put it in a Christian context. This will be a little gentler. So there's an idea out of Catholicism, not out of Protestant Christianity, but out of Catholicism, that a child cannot be baptized. Well, they're baptized at birth, but they cannot be confirmed. And that's for all my Baptist confessional people who have probably long since turned this off. No offense. But that is what Catholics believe. You can be baptized at birth, but then you are confirmed at the age of 7, right? Because at the age of 7, Catholic doctrine says that you understand the difference between right and wrong. You may not know all the moral complexities, but you know what is right and you know what is incorrect. And you can make an active choice. You can have active, they don't use the word agency, but that's what they mean. You can have active agency in your own life starting at the age of 7. Okay. Now, Protestants will push back on that. My Protestant brethren will push back on that in all kinds of different ways, and that's okay. You have been ever since like 1525 or so, since that fellow Martin Luther nailed something to the wall of a door of a church somewhere. It's fine. I understand. I'm only pointing that out as a touch point of where maybe child agency begins. Because we have this idea that children are, particularly in the West, and it is an idea, by the way, that comes with some legs underneath it. So in the pagan world, before Christianity, children were property at best. They were people that worked on a farm at best. At worst, they were literally anything you could do with them. And they died early, many of them. There were a lot of them that were birthed, but there were a lot of them that didn't make it. Infant mortality was extremely high. And so it was like a kid was a valuable farm implement, quite frankly. And children were treated in ways that, even just in normal society now, whatever normal may mean, we would be aghast at. And pagan's culture, I mean, Greek pagan culture, my God, children were sexually available to men, as were women, by the way, as were slaves. And by the way, sometimes those categories overlapped. We don't like to talk about that, by the way, with Greek culture, but that's the dirty underpinning of Plato, by the way. So then this weird thing that came out of the Western Palestine, this fellow named Jesus died, and then his followers went around and said, maybe it would be a good idea to treat women and children as if they're actually human beings. I don't know. And then they yelled and screamed about that for 2,000 years. And now we get to this point where we're at now, where children are either viewed as an economic burden that's not worth having, which is weird in our time, but that's where we're at now, or where they are viewed on the opposite end, the polarizing end, as being so hothouse precious that we have to set up everything for them and clear the land for them everywhere. That way they experience no potential trauma, no potential kicking of rocks, nothing of any kind. And if they do, it's a poor reflection on us as parents.
But they get a trophy anyway.
And they're going to get a trophy anyway. And it's weird because we're Americans. We can't hit the center of the target. We just can't. We got to swing back and forth between those two. Okay, fine. Then you have children in other parts of the world who are still very much treated in a weird combination of pagan and Christian sort of framing, depending upon what area of the world you go to and what culture is there and their fundamental beliefs and so on, right? Okay, that's children. Boys and girls are treated differently as children, right? And we don't like to talk about the idea that both boys and girls might have agency in their own lives, particularly at our time in the West. So now let's talk about little girls. Can little girls have agency in their own lives? Yes, but this is where the but is, because two things can't be true on this one at the same time. Yes, but they're hothouse flowers. Yes, but you don't want to send them to a Nickelodeon show where they could run into a producer. I saw that thing on Netflix. I didn't watch it because I didn't want to see, I didn't want to know, but everything that I suspected was behind that door, Nickelodeon and Disney. Behind that door, yeah, Nickelodeon, right, and Disney. Yeah, I don't want to know. How much agency does the child have in that particular situation? By the way, I was talking with my wife about this. I was like, this is why, like, our kids will never, like, if our kid has a talent in that direction, I'll wait till you're an adult. Because there's predators back there, right? Or there might be predators back there. Who are the kinds of people, and I'll even frame this in my own terms, because I know we're wrapping up here, but when I think of Lolita, I think of how when I was working in colleges and universities for years and years and years with 17, 18, 19-year-old girls, one of the standard rules, and I use girls on purpose, sorry, but one of the standard rules was you do not meet with a female student, and increasingly towards the end of my career, it became male student, without the door open and your colleague across the hall having their door open. You just don't do it. It's too much of a risk. By the way, not a risk necessarily always to them from me, but to me from them. They're the ones that can say anything, and then I'm out of a job. What does that mean? Well, it means they have agency. It means we're saying that they have some sort of power dynamic in this situation. So the question you're asking is, does Lolita have power here? Is she using her power? I think that makes us very, very uncomfortable to even think about that. Because Lolita's what, 15, 14? One of
I
yeah,
mean, in the beginning, when he first meets her, what is she, 12?
something like that. I
Yeah.
mean, I have two daughters. One's 19 and one's 14. That makes me extremely uncomfortable
Right.
because I look at my 14-year-old like, you have no, no, let's not even finish the sentence.
Right.
It just doesn't exist. Sorry. And you know what? Hey, maybe that means it's 1950 in my house. Meanwhile, it's 2024 out there. Maybe that's what that means. And that's Tony Soprano. Speaking of mafia,
No,
Tony Soprano used to say back in the day.
this is you again saying, hey, buddy, in high school,
Yeah,
looking at my daughter, as long as you stay on that side of the street, we don't have a problem.
we don't have a problem. Right. We don't have a grown man problem. We won't have an issue.
Right.
Right. Now, I can't prevent what's going on in your head. That's between you and whoever, the transcendent, whatever you may or may not believe in.
Right.
You can work it out with him. But
Right.
as far as working anything out with me, please, let's not even open up the conversation, right? Which sometimes gets me in trouble with my wife. And she's like, hey, you got to trust, blah, blah, blah. We raised her well, blah, blah, blah. But yes, I know. And I grumble because I know what the world is. But I also know that she has agency. Both my daughters have agency. They can both make decisions on their own to a certain degree. And applying that sort of thinking to Lolita as a character, one of the things that's interesting is, and it is a point that critics have made, the novel both silences her and objectifies her at the same time. And that's been something that's been a recurring, sort of criticism about this since like the 80s and the 90s, right, of this book. But since Humbert is only telling the story and we seem to be absorbed with his feelings, it's not really about her as like a flesh and blood individual. It's about her as a memory, or to use a modern word, she's an avatar in his head of something else, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what makes it complicated for me to even land on anything about her, because I've got my own thoughts, right, in my own head of my avatar of what my experiences are, my daughters, my whatever. Okay, I got all my doors in my head, both in the floor and in the walls that are open metaphorically. But then I've also got to deal with the novel and with Nabokov, and I've got to deal with the fact that she doesn't have a voice. She doesn't get to speak, right?
Right.
And he frames her as manipulating him, but that he's unreliable. He's a liar.
Right.
He's a humbug. So maybe there's no truth in any of this, which is what I fundamentally may get to. There's no truth in any of this. And maybe this is a novel of lies. And it doesn't matter if Lolita has agency or not from the age of 7 or whenever it is that she's framed. It doesn't matter because she wouldn't have had any anyway, because she can't, because she's coming out of like Athena out of the head of Zeus. She's springing forth from, Humbert fully formed.
Yeah. And I would, first of all, I 100% agree with you. I think any judgment, and I am conscious of the fact that earlier in this conversation, I was even suggesting maybe she's manipulating him, when the reality is we can make no judgment on her because we don't know her side of the story. And I'll go even further. She may not exist outside of his imagination at all, because maybe he's still sitting in the asylum and has fantasized the whole thing.
And now you're at the end of that TV show Lost, and this is where we end the podcast. My God. I didn't know you were going to go there.
I'm just saying, like, when you, because again, I'm sitting here, I was listening to you sort of trying to sort, you're doing a sorting exercise right now about what you feel Lolita is. And the reality is she may have manipulated him. She may have been, a sociopath from the word go. She may have seduced him, but we do not know because he's an unreliable narrator. And all I can conclude is that he manipulated us.
Yeah.
Because it's all in his telling.
Yep.
And whether he wrote that from a prison cell in some sort of posthumous defense of his life, or to immortalize someone he was obsessed with, or to while away the days because he's actually in a straitjacket. We don't know because he manipulated the entire time we spent with him.
So I just answered my own question about will this novel continue on the other end of the fourth turning? And I think it will, particularly as we wind up in a world of artificial intelligence and virtual reality, where, to paraphrase from Yuval Noah Harari, who's about to be the leader of the World Economic Forum, replacing Klaus Schwab at some point, from what I'm hearing in the scuttlebutt, we will build our own gods. Which that's not going to have any, that's not going to have any challenges. That's not going to be a problem at all. That'll be fine.
I can't see how that's going to be disruptive at all. So
no,
what
could
fine. Possibly go wrong?
There's no possible way we could screw that up. That'll be the one thing in the last 5,000 years we won't screw up. Just that one. They'll be fine. It'll all work out in the end.
It'll all work out in the end. If it doesn't work out, it's not the end.
Yeah. Oh my. No, I think that's a good spot to stop. I want to thank you, Claire, for coming on the podcast again. I do want to thank you, honestly, for the book recommendation. I would, like I said before, I would have gotten to it eventually, but I don't know that I would have had as robust a conversation with somebody about it as I've had with you today. So I want to thank you for suggesting it and for coming on and talking about it, and having the courage to sort of dig into this a little bit. And because it does take a measure of intellectual courage to do that, and a measure of sort of even just moral courage, right? Like, how do you read this and still come out whole on the other side, and knowing what is what, and understanding that, and really navigating that. So I want to thank you for joining me on this journey today. What would you like to promote today, if anything?
Actually, nothing other than for your audience to go out and pick up this book. I think for all the reasons, especially those, if they have stuck around for this long and they've listened to all the doors in the floor that we have opened up to explore, this is a book that begs conversation afterwards. So go and read it. I'm going to go check out the Stanley Kubrick version just because, his film adaptation. But go read the book.
Yeah, go check out Lolita. Of course, you can check out Claire Chandler in all the places where you can Google Claire Chandler. She has a book out right now. It's not as it's probably better than Lolita, right?
I don't think it's as nearly as controversial. At least I hope not. But hopefully it's thought provoking.
Yeah, exactly. Growth on Purpose, and got that in all the different formats and all the different places. Are you appearing on podcasts or in videos? I see your stuff pop up on LinkedIn. So are you appearing anywhere? Are you doing anything?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, growthonpurpose.com. If anyone's interested, they can go and check out the book and some other stuff on there. But yeah, LinkedIn is my social media of choice. So
absolutely. And check her out and all the work that she does with organizations through her efforts at Talent Boost. All right. Well, once again, I'd like to thank you for listening to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast today. And with that, we're out. Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast today. And now that you've made it this far, you should subscribe to the audio version of this show on all the major podcast players, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, YouTube Music, and everywhere else where podcasts are available. There's also a video version of our podcast on our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the Leadership Toolbox channel on YouTube. Just search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button there on YouTube. And while you're doing that, leave a 5-star review if you like what we're doing here on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Just go below the player and hit 5 stars. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to help grow this show. And tell all your friends, of course, in leadership. By the way, if you don't like what we're doing here, you can always listen to another leadership show. There are several other good ones out there. At least that's what I've heard. All right. Well, that's it for me.